This is the panel focusing on cybersecurity, which for many companies is now a top 3 risk. Certainly companies are managing cybersecurity risk across their enterprise, but increasingly, for a variety of reasons, very much focused on managing third-party risk, whether that's in your supply chain, your value chain, or whatever it is that helps your ecosystem be successful. I'm Pamela Passman. I'm the Vice Chair of Ethisphere. I work with Bella members and companies on third-party risk, among other issues. I bring to this conversation 15 years at Microsoft, where I was based both in Asia and in Redmond, Washington, focused on a range of regulatory and policy issues across privacy, security, law enforcement, national security, telecom, all the issues that are critical to cloud services. So I will bring that perspective to the discussion, but I'm thrilled to have really 2 leaders in their disciplines joining me on the panel. Tim Fitzgerald is the Senior Vice President and CISO, Chief Information Security Officer of ARM, one of the leading providers of semiconductors. A really interesting company, a British company now owned by SoftBank,
Correct.
a Japanese information technology investment company. I think that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, SoftBank, if you don't know them, like the biggest venture capital fund in the planet now by a large margin.
Tim had prior positions at Symantec, a security company, but you were involved in the security of Symantec as the Chief Security Officer. And also joined by Eric Kobrick, who's the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of AIG. I'm sure you all know AIG, a leading finance and insurance company operating in 100 countries around the world. I've lived a lot in Asia, and it's a very, very well-known brand across Asia. Mm-hmm. Eric leads legal units focused on technology, data privacy, cybersecurity, IP, innovation, sourcing, and branding. Just think about that. Those are so many different areas that legal teams didn't support 10 years ago.
Yep, absolutely.
And all of a sudden, it's part of a very significant portfolio. You've also led legal teams for supporting different businesses at AIG as well. Mm-hmm. We're going to have the benefit of Eric also talking about cyber insurance and how that market is developing and growing and how it's become really an important part of risk mitigation, in particular with third parties. So just to provide some context for our discussion, managing cyber risk has moved very much from the information technology or the CIO's office to being led by somebody who really thinks about this from a cross-functional perspective, bringing in many roles, including roles sitting in this room today, compliance, legal, risk, to really help define how the organization will manage this risk proactively. And this, of course, has been driven by a number of factors, a very volatile, fast-moving threat environment, but also the recognition of the key to the viability of an organization, the continuity of an organization, and of course a regulatory environment that I'm going to say is on steroids. And you can disagree with me if you want, but whether you're in critical infrastructure, financial services, banking, health, energy, you're part of the Department of Defense supply chain, you're part of cloud services, or really, any company that has a business that crosses oceans, if you will. I mean, certainly GDPR assumes an organization has an information security management system that is robust in place. And of course, we see increasingly this is basic contractual requirements that companies have, that their third parties have to have, and to have to be able to attest and assess and verify their capabilities. So we're going to really focus on this third-party risk, and I'm going to start off by saying this is really early days even for very sophisticated companies. So we really want to help provide some framework for everyone to think this through. Tim is going to kick us off with some comments, and then Eric will follow. We'll have a discussion up here on the panel, but we very much want to bring you all. This is intimate enough where if you've got questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring you into the discussion.
Great. Thanks very much. So this is an interesting topic for me. I've been involved in cybersecurity since before cybersecurity was really a coined term that we talked about at companies, and certainly not a topic that was covered in the boardroom. And I've seen the evolution of security go all the way from your CISO or your head of security being responsible for antivirus and firewalls, like the very technology-based approach to security, all the way to what cybersecurity is now largely is a risk-based function, right? So in many respects, you'll have CISOs like myself who are not hyper-technical, whose job it is to help manage risk. And this topic around third-party risk is, or value chain risk, or whatever we want to call it, is a really, should be the number one topic in the cybersecurity conversation with boards. It's not right now. In most cases, many companies are still talking about their technical controls, their regulatory attestations, the incident response capabilities, which are all super important functions of a cybersecurity department and service within a company. But third-party risk, in my opinion, is the most likely way that companies are going to lose data in the very near future. And it's already happening today, as we'll talk about a little bit more. One of the things that I think is really interesting that we're going to touch on a little bit later is that this has gone further than third-party risk, meaning does your supplier, vendor, or partner create a risk for you based on how they operate, to are they a target as a means to get to you, which is a very real risk for companies like ARM and the size of ARM and Symantec. I spent most of my career working around protecting companies whose lifeblood is intellectual property. So things that are very easily taken if somebody has the right level of access. And the numbers are a little fuzzy depending on which company you talk about, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of the real data loss events we have are direct result of a third-party issue. Mm-hmm. So this should be, if it's not already top of mind for companies, this should be very much top of mind. And the reality is most companies are not very good at dealing with this right now, including ARM, by the way. I mean, sort of mea culpa for us is that this is a hard discipline to figure out what to do. ARM's a company that, for those that don't know, that develops intellectual property behind how you create silicon chips. We don't create them like Intel. We create the intellectual property behind them, and then we sell that to someone else who white labels it and sells the chip on their own. So the reason I bring that up is because our entire working model requires us to be really deep in bed with our partners and vendors who are going to ultimately sell this product, which means they have access to our environment and our intellectual property almost throughout the entire life cycle. And so our community, or our intellectual property is not necessarily our own. We don't directly control it, and we put a huge amount of trust into these partners to do the right thing around protecting our intellectual property. And our ability to assess whether or not they are doing the right thing is quite difficult, in part because there's no global norms and standards on how you assess a third party, and in parts because everyone does this slightly differently, and the lexicon and the way that we talk to each other makes it really challenging to figure out whether or not they're doing a good or a bad job. For ARM's part, we take a very risk-based approach to this. We have literally thousands of vendors that we do business with, but they're not all equal and equivalent. And so we take a very risk-based approach either on the amount of revenue they generate for us, the amount of intellectual property they have access to, or the amount of risk we think they bring to us as a business, and put them through various levels of scrutiny, depending on the severity of or the importance of the relationship. And that can go all the way from we audit them, like physically go out and look at what they do around security, all the way down to you complete a questionnaire. We don't really check on your responses. We just assume by virtue of answering the questionnaire that you're thinking about it. The one thing that I think is interesting that we're going to dive into a little bit more here is that there's a whole cottage industry that has been built around how to assess third-party risk, from companies that sell services to try and help you facilitate understanding what the risk is for your organizations, to departments being created within all these major companies who are all doing this in a slightly different way and justifying their own jobs and positions based on how they are assessing third-party risk for their particular company. And that is something that I think is really inhibiting our ability to do this well right now. And so it's a personal pet peeve of mine, one you're going to hear about a little bit more here, is that while I agree we're sort of hyper-regulated right now, in this particular space on how you assess risk for third party, there's almost nothing in place that says here's how to do it. And it's something that I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks in this room and perhaps cyber insurance and some of the other things we're looking at to start driving.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Eric?
Sure. So, I'm a little newer to the space than Tim, but I've made kind of a few, preliminary observations which I'd like to share with you. One, it's really hard to manage third-party cybersecurity risk. So if you're out there thinking that, how does everyone else do it so well and I'm struggling with it, you should lose that thought because not everybody is doing it so well. So you're right in the mix. It's difficult to identify, all your third parties at the outset, especially if you're a big, multinational company. Not only do you have to identify them, you have to understand, whether they're getting your data, how they're getting your data. So it's not as simple as, looking at, an accounts payable listing of, what third parties you do business with. It's also difficult to differentiate among your vendors. At AAG, we'll deal with, classic vendors and suppliers, but we'll also deal with law firms and consultants and accounting firms and brokers and agents. And, there's a drive to treat them similarly, but you have to appreciate there are differences among them, and you have to, balance the need for uniformity against the recognition that you can't treat all vendors the same. There's a drive towards centralization, but that's also very difficult if you're a multinational company. I mean, you want to have a consistent approach, but how are you going to force, every business unit throughout the world to, to turn over the task of monitoring and assessing your third parties to one, central group or location. You also have struggles with tracing your data even beyond third parties. So your third parties, there might be fourth parties and fifth parties. So, how do you trace the data along the entire supply chain? So those are just a few of the high-level observations I've noted in terms of, how difficult it is in this space. So it's a journey. And it's not going to be, completed that quickly. The second kind of overarching observation I've made is that, at least at a big company, it's a team sport. You need the involvement of, your business owners in the first instance. I mean, those are the people who want to retain the outside vendor. If you have a separate sourcing department, they'll act as the liaison between your business and the vendor. Your enterprise risk management folks are going to want to get involved and make sure the overall framework for dealing with the third-party vendor is adequate. And that involves not only information security assessments, but also issues like business continuity and disaster recovery, the financial wherewithal of your third party, a host of other issues. Then you'll get your IT folks in to really focus on the information security assessment, to really do a deep dive on the controls at your vendor. Legal and compliance play a key role as well in understanding the legal and regulatory framework and ensuring that our business folks and others are familiar with it and that we're complying with all laws and regulations. And I'm sure I'm missing others, internal audit, to come in and check this all at the end of the day as kind of a third line of defense. So you can't master third-party security in isolation. It has to be, like I call it, a team sport. It really does take a village. And then third, and I'm not sure I need to persuade anybody of the importance of this, it is really critical to effectively manage your third-party cybersecurity risk. You risk losing your customer data. You risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk. If you have trade secrets that you might, sacrifice, there are business continuity implications. You might have to shut down all a part of your business depending on, the nature of the relationship you have with your third party. So we're not kind of crying wolf about this topic. It really is, critical to companies to, get on top of.
Great, thank you, both of you. I think it'd be helpful before we sort of dig into sort of, the different layers of the onion, if you will, about actually managing a program, to talk a little bit about the threat environment. Tim mentioned that, about 70% of breaches are facilitated through a third party. But really, when you sort of dig into some of the research by some of the security firms, as well as the U.S. intelligence community and other intelligence arms, there's a huge focus on the part of it. I call them the bad guys, because they're mostly guys and not gals, but the bad guys. They are very focused on third parties to get to the bigger players. And I appreciated your focus, Tim, on intellectual property, because there's so much focus on PII and PHI and financial data, but really these bad guys are very focused on intellectual property and trade secrets and business confidential information.
Yeah, and they're, not to oversimplify this, but there's really two camps of bad guys out there, right? There are those who are trying to monetize immediately, and they're looking for things like PII and other things they can monetize, and there are those who are looking for strategic advantage of some way. And that often is in the form of intelligence gathering or intellectual property theft. One of the really interesting developments over the last couple of years, if you want to go back and sound super knowledgeable about what's happening in this space, you can talk about ATP-10, which is abbreviated for Advanced Persistent Threat Attack Group 10, which the global community has labeled these various attack groups so we know who we're talking about. General wisdom is that this is a group that is funded and facilitated by the Chinese government, whose sole job it is to break into Western-based companies and steal intellectual property as a means of strategic advantage for their own purposes. Now, whether you can agree or disagree whether that's the right attribution, but the fact that this group is operating it is a fact. And this group's MO is not, well, in some cases, is to break into tech companies directly, but their current MO is actually to go after service providers, in particular, big service providers who do IT services for companies and legal firms, as a means of a point of entry into these companies. Because when you break into those companies, you get access to many, not just one, right? So you do the same amount of work potentially to hack into these companies, and in many cases is work, right? These are groups that operate in shifts, right? You can see very much their attack pattern is attached to the 9 to 5 in the Beijing time zone. Again, I won't only pick on China, I'll pick on other countries later. But and they are putting in a significant amount of effort to get into these companies. So if you can do that one time and then get access to many accounts, wouldn't that be a better solution? And so that is what is happening right now. And we've seen some really significant revelations over the last, well, really 8 to 12 months where these service providers and law firms are being attacked directly as a means of getting in. So where you might think that you've got a trusted relationship with your partner, pick law firm X, who has significant access to your data, how well they're protected and whether or not you would know if there's something was happening there is really germane to your business now, and something that we have to get much better at evaluating.
So, Eric, help us understand a little bit about how you sort of look at your large number of third parties and how you think about segmenting the risk.
Sure, and as I preliminarily alluded to, you can't treat all third parties alike. So, we will look at various factors in the first instance. What type of data is the third party getting? Is it getting personal identifiable information? Is it getting confidential information or privileged information? We will look at whether the data is going to be stored by the third party or whether the third party is going to gain access to our systems. And we'll look at the volume of that data. And then based on the answers to those questions, which we need our business folks and sourcing folks to answer, we will risk rate our vendors, low, medium, elevated, or high. And then we will send out a questionnaire to those vendors. And depending if they're a low risk vendor or perceived to be low risk, they'll get X number of questions. If they're a high risk vendor, they'll get X plus Y plus Z number of questions. And the questions will talk all about, understanding their, encryption policies, understanding their access controls, and various, related issues like that. Once we get the answers back, our IT experts will study them, will engage in dialogue with the vendors, and to the extent they feel that there are issues that need to be remediated, they'll engage in discussions with the vendor about, what they're prepared to remediate, how they're prepared to remediate it, on what time frame they're prepared to remediate it. Then they'll typically go back to our business owners because at the end of the day, it's a risk acceptance process. And the business owner will either say, yes or no, I want to go forward in light of what the vendor is prepared or not prepared to do. If the vendor's not prepared to do much and it's a very high risk, then it'll be escalated at our company to very senior levels within the business as well as in our, probably to the chief information officer of that business unit as well. And if we decide to go forward with the vendor, we'll have a contract. And the contract will have a data security schedule attached to it as a general matter. And that data security schedule will form a part of the contract. So if there's a breach of anything in that schedule, it will be considered a breach of contract. And that will lay out all the security obligations that vendor, that we're imposing on that vendor. And it will also lay out any remedial steps that we're requiring the vendor to take. That's kind of step one. Step two is, you don't want that just to be in writing. You want to follow up on it. You want to make sure that the vendor takes the steps that they've agreed to take to remediate whatever gaps existed. And even if there aren't remediation steps, we have, at regular intervals, we monitor the vendor. If it's a high-risk vendor, we'll obviously monitor it more frequently than a low-risk vendor, but it doesn't stop with just the initial onboarding. We also require in that data security schedule training. The vendor has to make sure that all staff that are involved with respect to information security issues are trained in privacy and data security laws and various other aspects that are important to the relationship between the two of us. We don't explicitly extend the contract to fourth-party risks, but we put the burden on our third-party vendors to ensure that whoever they retain meet the same requirements that we're imposing on our third party. So it's not perfect, but I think it has a lot of teeth to it.
So there's interesting points in there because one of the things I want to point out is that, I mean, you guys know this, but relationships change over time, right? And in many cases, you start with one contract and then you take a bunch of different additional services on with a provider that should change the nature of what you're looking at, but often doesn't. And so that's something to think about in your program is that as you grow the relationship with partners, you do need to periodically reevaluate. But I guess, Eric, a question back to you.
Sure.
In my experience, cybersecurity considerations very rarely stop a contract from going forward. It might be that we can get them to do a few things to remediate, but it often doesn't kill the contract. And so in that regard, you're sometimes writing, it's more about the terms and the liabilities being written in as it is about like whether they're actually doing it properly. Is that similar to your experience? And how do you deal with that?
No, I do think that's right. I think, I think we find as a general matter, that the remedial steps we require our third parties to take, are for their own best interest, or in their own best interest. So more often than not, they'll agree. We might disagree around the edges in terms of how quickly they'll take those steps, especially if there's a huge financial burden associated with it. But more often than not, we get agreement there. If the business, the first instinct, like you say, of the business, if you raise issues with them, is not, okay, we'll walk away and not use this vendor. They typically already have a lot invested in using that vendor at that point in time. So they'll say to you, what is truly critical and what can we put in the contract to give us, to make our rights have as much teeth as possible. So we'll work with the IT folks and they will, really, sharpen their pens in terms of, what controls are really critical to us. Is it okay that they only, change their passwords every 3 weeks as opposed to every, 2 weeks? What can we live with versus what we can't live with? And then the lawyers will sharpen their pencils with respect to the contracts and really, make clear the obligations and make clear the penalties if those obligations aren't fulfilled. So that's more or less how we deal with the situation where we realistically know the business partner does not want to walk away from this partner.
Yeah, I'm having an interesting experience right now where we're getting into contract with another company owned by SoftBank, who owns us wholly. So you would think that we could get along pretty well. And we're currently having trouble living up to their obligations that they write in their security requirements because they're very specific, right? They've gone to the nth degree of the type of control required, whereas the approach we take is a very principle-based approach, which says you need, you should have robust access controls versus you need to have passwords at this length and this, and actually the divergence between companies and around the industry in terms of what the level of expectation of performance is so wide that it's making it very difficult to jump in there.
It's very expensive for AIG to have this program. I imagine you're hiring more people to actually work in the space, or
not enough.
But then and you are focused on your supply chain, but you are also in lots of other companies' value chain. So going back to something that Tim said, there's no global norms today on how to assess an organization's cybersecurity capabilities. You can have it at a very high level. You can have it at a very detailed control level. There's, of course, ISO 27001 that's been around for a long time. And if it was effective as one would hope, then you wouldn't need other things. But clearly there is a need for other approaches. The NIST cybersecurity framework in the United States has also gotten a lot of attention, not only beyond critical infrastructure in the U.S., but other countries are adopting similar efforts. But this idea that a company has to respond to all these different individual questionnaires that are similar but different.
They're not that similar. They're just not, right? I think this is one of the challenges. So I'm a big advocate for security frameworks. The NIST and cybersecurity framework and ISO 27001, 27002 are essentially the same framework in different languages, right? There's very little daylight between them when you go through that analysis. And they are a very good prescriptive guide on the things you should do. They don't lay out how you should do it, but they say what you should do. And what I still fail to understand as a professional and partly responsible for this problem is why more companies are not leaning on that as a norm and a standard that we assess to. What you often find is somebody in an organization takes their own special spin, which generally is based off these frameworks, and then they apply, the ARM way of doing it and say, we're special, therefore we're going to have these 15 things that you have to do, even though they sit outside this global norm and standard. which then multiplies across everyone you do business with, which means everybody's asking for something different. And it is, I mean, as I said before, a cottage industry. I mean, there's people who've made their entire career now based on responding to and creating these questionnaires in a really inefficient manner. And I do think that there's a significant opportunity for us to adopt standardization across this. I don't think it's going to happen with the current global norms and standards, or it would have happened already. But I do think there's an opportunity for, I'm going to sort of segue here and pivot, because I do think there's an opportunity for industries like cyber insurance and others who have this broad view of what's really happening in the world to define a standard on what would be considered an appropriate assessment mechanism, so that we're not all jumping through these hoops. That money could be so much better spent actually protecting
Right.
the data
Yep.
rather than jumping through all these hoops.
Yep. You know, I think we'll get there. I think it's a journey. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. We have what I would refer to as kind of a hybrid approach now, where, you know, during the questionnaire process, we might get vendors to come back and say, well, you know, we have this ISO certification, or we have PCI certification, et cetera. Doesn't that count for something? And we say yes, but it's not the be-all and end-all, and we still want you to answer questions, 1 through 20. Similarly, in the data security schedule, we'll refer in certain instances to, you have to meet industry standards, whether it's the NIST cyber security framework or others. So we are kind of gradually moving there, but I don't see companies, given, like you said earlier on, Pamela, we're in kind of early days. I don't see companies, abandoning yet their own, idiosyncratic, questions for their vendors.
Just take a pause. Any comments, questions from the audience?
I have a question that's really practical. So we do, with Paychecks, we handle a lot of private information. So we have a robust data security team. And we've developed, as we've grown, we've sort of developed our own ways of doing things over the years, right? So different people know, oh, that's how we handle this kind of data, that's how we handle that kind of issue, right? And it's kind of a more informal, really, approach where we're doing the things that you're talking about because that's just how we do them. We've gotten to a point now where we've grown sufficiently large that we need more formality, more policies written, right? More documentation and artifacts to govern it. So we're going through the whole, NIST framework and how do we draft a risk appetite statement? How do you put pen to paper on things that are common sense and things that we're all doing and approaches that we know we're using, but putting pen to paper to actually create those formal documents. Is there a resource that you're aware of out there that can help companies as they're going through those growing pains to try to figure out, well, how do other people create their risk appetite statement? We've got one for financial risk, but how do we decide how to define in words what our risk appetite is for cyber issues?
Yeah, not to be flippant, but copy other people. The thing is that this has been solved in some way, shape, or form. So the frameworks you're talking about are the right ones, right? I mean, the founding a cybersecurity program in those frameworks and choosing your risk language from those frameworks is my opinion, the right way to do this. And it will put you in line with just about all the other big players. And this is not an uncommon story for companies that are sort of small to medium size who are just kind of finding their legs around this stuff, where most of the big companies have sorted this out already. If I were in your position, I would pick a couple of your big providers that you have a good relationship with, and I would ask them to provide input to how you create that program and perhaps steal from them their ideas on how they do it.
But Stephanie, you guys, a great point. The Bella community has been very much focused on other aspects of compliance.
Right.
But this is a great way for us to really expand what we can do in the Bella community to collect these kinds of examples. We do that a lot in the other policy areas. But we should really learn from each other, because this is very similar to other areas that the ethics and compliance community has worked in for decades.
Given the prevalence of doing BPO outsourcing and the vulnerabilities of human middleware, especially if you talk about call centers, et cetera, how do you guys manage that? I mean, it's easy to talk about this is what we want your infrastructure security to be, but we've actually found more challenges with trying to both audit and specify the security processes around, kind of those human vulnerabilities where social engineering. So you mentioned training, but beyond that, are there any ideas or solutions that you guys have used?
Yes. So I like to call this the helpful people problem, right? I used to call it the stupid people problem, but I got in trouble for that. So most people are trying to be helpful, right? And if you ask someone to help you, they generally will, right? I mean, that's just general psychology, is that people will like to be helpful. And most social engineering is preying on the fact that people like to be helpful. They're not particularly sophisticated. They're not particularly tricky, although they can be. They're generally just asking questions and people are helping and responding. And so training is a big element of that, although we find, like over my career, I've found that sort of the computer-based annualized training, it really doesn't do very much. Like, you have to check the box, but it really does not drive behavior. What we're finding particularly helpful at ARM, which by the way is an extremely high trust organization, we like to put a lot of faith in our employees to use good judgment and exercise their ability to choose and decide, which is problematic when it comes to this kind of stuff. That getting down to the point of like using real examples that have happened within your company, being willing to talk about that, right? Many companies are not, but I think you need to be willing to talk about what has happened, real examples, without naming and shaming the person that it happened to. And having like hyper-connected, not individual, but almost individual feeling type training, where you have somebody like myself or somebody in the security team going out and talking to these teams directly, including your partners, right? So we go out and we spend time having these sessions with our partners in kind of the spirit of sharing, but it's actually a training session where we're talking to them about our expectations on what they need to do and the behaviors we want to see from them. I don't think there's not a magic bullet to the human equation here. I think, but getting to the point where you can make this personally relevant to people, and so they understand why in their specific job this is important, is helpful. It's not easy to do, and it's more expensive to do it that way, but from my perspective, yields much better results.
I would pretty much echo everything that Tim just said. I mean, I think you need to have those clear policies in place at the outset. Then you need to have good communication of them, so nobody could claim that they don't know about them. Go out and do training, make it as effective as possible. There are various means of doing it, but like you say, make it personal for people, and then monitor enforcement of it and have real consequences if somebody violates the policy. And make it known around the company that there are consequences. It's kind of the carrot and stick approach, reward the good behavior, but you need to punish the bad.
It's tricky, right? Because I agree with that. You do need, especially when somebody sort of shows like egregious decision making or lack of judgment. You never want to go so far as to dissuade people from telling you about a security issue, right? Mm-hmm. Because the best thing they can do is tell you, so your professionals can respond really quickly and get in front of it. But there needs to be a little bit of folklore behind this, that as a company we take this seriously. There are implications to it, and if you can demonstrate that through repercussions to a partner, to the company, or to an individual, all of those are really effective at driving home the point.
And I think it goes to culture, as we talked a lot this morning. This is one of those issues where you really have to, from the top down to the bottom up, really talk about why this is important to your company, why this is important to your customers and clients, why this is, for many companies, you are data companies. I mean, it is all about the information that you have. And so how do you, as an organization, really embed that into how people think, you embed it into your operations, you embed it into your relationships.
Well, I agree completely with that, and I just see in my company, and even outside this context, that when the CEO or one of the executive leadership team members talk about a topic, it all of a sudden becomes more important for everybody at the company. It gains that prominence, and they're like, wow, he or she really cares about X or Y or Z. I guess I should care about it. So I can't emphasize enough that you need your senior leaders to be behind you on this.
And you have to teach them how to talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. Me getting our CEO to talk up and say security is super important, it's one of our imperatives, it doesn't mean anything to people on the ground, right? So we've got to, I'm currently coaching our CEO on how to use real examples to drive these points home, because it's important. I think another thing you might consider, it kind of depends on what your company is and who your customers are, but if you have a big partner / customer who can come in and talk to your company about why cybersecurity is important to them, that has a tremendous amount of impact. It's one thing to think about your own house. It's another thing to think about your neighbor's house and how you might support them. And I think for us, that's been really effective in terms of reaching people and getting them to sort of personally buy into the fact that they have accountability around this, not just that people use the term the weakest link in the chain all the time around this, around security. I really think that's a horrible term, because it implies that people don't care, and they do. You just have to find a reason to get them to align around it.
Let's just spend a few minutes talking about small and medium enterprises, because every organization has within their value chain a large number of small and medium enterprises. And these organizations are especially challenged when it comes to cybersecurity. how are your organizations thinking about them, how you're interacting, and how is it different from some of the larger third parties?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that different. I mean, the focus is really on what risk the third party presents to us, and a small and medium enterprise vendor might present a high risk to us, and a large vendor might present a low risk to us. So, we'll work with the small and medium enterprise companies. Perhaps there will be a greater reliance on industry certifications. We'll have perhaps a shorter questionnaire. We could do an on-site visit if they just have one location as opposed to 30 or 40. But at the end of the day, the focus is more on our risk than it is on the size or capabilities of the third party. So there's not a lot of play in the process to date.
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts on especially the small size ones, and ARM has a lot of these because we do a lot of things that are very unique in chip design. Small companies will sign up to almost anything in order to get a contract with a big company, right? So including cyber, yeah, we do all of that. Don't worry about it. Liability and the type of liability they're putting on the table will put them under, right? So you've got to be really wary of that. And in many cases, we find that when we have these small companies, we try not to do business with small companies unless they're really necessary, because they generally can't meet the standard around this and financial liquidity and a whole bunch of other things. But when we do, someone from my team essentially gets assigned to them as a coach/mentor who spends real time with them talking about their improvements to their program, what they're doing, how they're growing. It's a pretty big investment and one you can't scale, right? So you got to be careful on how you do that. But at both Symantec and at ARM, we found that to be very effective. If they're strategically important to us, we have to invest in them too. And that means helping them come up the chain. In many cases, it's very positively received, right? People want to do the right thing, they just don't know what to do. To your point, how do you make that jump? Well, we've got decades and decades of experience on my team to come and help them do that. And so we play a little bit of that role. So it's something to think about.
Let's just pivot to cyber insurance. And in particular, this is a growing market for small and medium enterprises. Many big customers are requiring everybody in their supply chain, but in particular small and medium enterprises, to have cyber insurance. This is also very early days for cyber insurance, but you could imagine over a period of time the kind of data that cyber insurance companies such as AIG will have that will enable the broader community to focus on certain things that really lead to certain kinds of risks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like you said, it is still early days. I think cyber insurance, first showed up in kind of the late 90s and, at the .com era. But it has come a long way, even though it still has a long way to go. And there still is a general, I think, consensus out there that companies are underinsured when it comes to their cyber exposure. We do require, our third-party vendors to carry cyber insurance and meaningful limits, but we'll work with them as well. And this goes to your point about small and medium enterprise companies in terms of the limits that we might require them to have. But it is a growing area. It's a complicated area. When you talk about having cyber insurance coverage, like it's some monolithic coverage out there. There are all types of different coverage forms. You get coverage for all types of different instances, and the coverage is expanding. Oftentimes, coverage now includes property damage and bodily injury, whether it's first party, your own company, or third party, somebody, suing you. There's coverage for ransomware attacks. There's coverage for manipulation of your data as opposed to just, destruction or inability to access your data. There's coverage for supply chain. So you really need to, it's not a simple area. You need to work with your insurer, work with your broker, understand what your needs are, understand where you'll get the most bang for your buck when it comes to purchasing cyber insurance. And it's not, nobody claims it's a panacea for all your, control deficiencies. It's a critical element of an overall risk management framework is how I like to think of it. It's necessary but not sufficient. But you need to really analyze the nature of the coverage you're getting, as well as the various ancillary services that your insurer might be able to provide for you. A lot of insurers are offering complementary services both at the front end, and the back end. The front end meaning, during the underwriting process, they'll work with you to understand where your control weaknesses are and where you'll get the most bang for your buck in plugging up those weaknesses. And then at the back end, they'll work with you if there's an incident. They have, a whole list of PR experts and forensics experts and law firm experts and others that may be able to assist you in effectively dealing with an incident. So there are lots of different considerations that I think go into hiring your cyber insurer. And then on the last point, yes, we're getting a lot of data, doing analytics in that data and then sharing the insights that we gain from those analytics is going to be of value to our clients.
Yeah.
There's no question about it.
3 or 4 years ago, I got invited by an insurance company from Australia to come and do a speaking tour with them. And interestingly, they let me talk about what I wanted, which was why do cyber insurance companies suck at evaluating risk? Just like everybody else, right? Because it's really hard to evaluate someone else's risk. And over the last couple of years, actually, there's a lot of progress that's been made, right? Insurance companies are hiring CISOs who really understand the type of things that need to go into various programs. They're getting much more articulate in the types of questions they're asking around trying to surface risk and where you have real gaps. And to your point, you should have a shared interest here,
Absolutely.
right? Which is that you don't have a major loss that needs to be covered, which means that in many cases you're now able to work much better together to mitigate risk across the company. One of the reasons I was pointing earlier on to cyber insurance as a kind of a potentially pivotal player in this is that they not only get to see the evaluation of risk at the front end of all these companies, and so perhaps we'll come up with a better mechanism of figuring out where risk exists, but they're not the only place that gets to see where the bad things actually happen, right? Most of the time when bad things happen in a company, you don't hear about it, and you don't hear about the underlying reasons of why those things happened, but insurance companies do. And so I think, not sure they'll ever share that with us for free, but I think the premise that type of organization who truly understands where controls are falling down and therefore what you should be paying attention to in your third-party evaluation process is going to be really valuable. And I expect, I don't know what the time frame is, but I expect in coming couple of years that's going to surface in some way, shape, or form.
And AIG also uses the NIST cybersecurity framework as one way to assess its potential policyholders.
When you're looking to purchase cyber insurance, you want to, like I said, have these conversations with your brokers and the insurers. And you ideally want an innovative company, a company that's kind of ahead of the curve in terms of, seeing the types of risks that companies are going to face. So some companies, were quicker than others to offer coverage for, privacy, law violations. I mean, obviously there's been a plethora of privacy laws that have sprung up with GDPR in California and other places. Ransomware attacks, obviously on the rise. The manipulation of data as opposed to the destruction or inability to access the data. So it's not for the faint of heart. There are a lot of insurers out there. There are a lot of forms out there. A lot of forms have multiple endorsements on them. So but it's worth the effort because it really is an important risk mitigation tool.
Let me open it up to the audience if there's any questions.
So you mentioned earlier about legal firms and maybe being a target. They've always, to me, both auditors and legal firms maybe had separate process for contract negotiations, and so it's a little bit of a white glove philosophy sometimes, right? So how are you changing that over in the differently to make sure that you're getting the right controls and the right engagement there?
It's a great question because, like I said earlier on, not all third parties consider themselves equal. That if you talk to a law firm like you talk to a paperclip supplier, they'll get all offended by that. But no more is kind of the philosophy we're taking with firms. I mean, they are your service providers. They want your business, and you have to tell them that we're in a different environment today than we were in terms of the threat environment, in terms of the regulatory environment. That that they don't get a pass is essentially the answer. And again, we'll work with them, but particularly law firms, they oftentimes might get the type of data that, if compromised, will cause real risk to companies. So you need to just explain to them in kind of clear but decisive terms that they're part of the fold now and need to subject themselves to the type of assessments that others traditionally have been.
It's not. I mean, not all law firms are equal, right, in terms of their size and scale and sophistication. And I like to joke with our general counsel that half of these guys have one IT guy in a closet who does their security, right? And that poor person trying to deal with all these lawyers who are running around with all the sensitive information who think they know better, right? That's kind of the world we live in. I think I completely agree with that. I think legal firms should be looked at with much more scrutiny than they are today in terms of cybersecurity risk, and not because they're particularly egregious in how they operate, but because the level of information they have is incredible, and the amount of harm that could be done based on a cybersecurity breach at that company is really if I could encourage you to look at two things if you're coming out of this, it would be your law firms and your third-party service providers who do IT services for you, because those are the ones that are likely to cause you the really big risk.
We've heard a lot from a number of Bella members about their concern with law firms, that they sort of fall out of the regular system of whether it's the procurement office or the legal team reviewing their cybersecurity. So we're working with a group of Bella members who are using the Ethisphere cybersecurity service that's aligned to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we've had a great reception from the law firms to use it. So it's early days, but hopefully over time, the law firm will do the assessment once a year, but then share it with the Bella members that sort of participate in this. Again, you want your third parties to focus on investing in maturing their practices, not answering all these questionnaires. So what are the models that the business community, the larger companies can create so that your third parties are focused on investing in their cybersecurity?
To make an observation, I think the larger law firms themselves are now more receptive. They have a much more higher sensitivity to risk. In-house, the legal department is reluctant to broach it.
Yeah.
But when they do broach it, the law firms are not as offended as perhaps they've
Right.
been in the
Yeah.
past, because it's much more routine.
Yeah.
So it's almost getting the in-house counsel.
I've not really seen any recent pushback in the last few years from law firms, right? This is,
One second. Another places, they're like, oh, bad things can happen.
yeah.
So I think it's the in-house teams where part of it is, here's a way you can broach this in an open, not offensive way, see what they say, and the law
Yeah.
firm tends to come
I
back,
will say that it,
no, it's fine, whatever, we're working through the process. They don't seem as scared. It's the right now, it seems, from what I've seen, it's the in-house.
Yeah, I mean, the law firms are very much aware of the threat environment and that they are a very specific target.
We had all our law firms go through our TPRA process, and they were fine
Yeah.
with it. I think the other danger is most in-house legal departments exempt themselves from the procurement
Right,
processes.
right.
They
Yeah.
do,
Yeah,
so.
yeah, exactly.
yes.
I'm just curious, do you, kind of looking at the law firm perspective, right, but also kind of broadening it, where else do companies give a lot of information, that if somebody was to hack into them, it would be very significant? Are you seeing that people are trying to go after either regulators or like accounting firms / consulting firms? Is it very similar?
Yes.
And I don't know, regulators, I'm guessing their systems probably aren't so great, and accounting probably a little bit crummy, but I'm curious if you've seen, any of them trying to go there as well.
I have not heard anything about a regulator being attacked as a means of getting access to some companies' intellectual property. Although it's an interesting idea, because in some cases they have a lot. IT providers are a big deal. Anyone who has access to your environment is a big deal. Accounting firms generally, like if you're in kind of like the big five, I mean, I've been in and around those companies for a long time, and I feel pretty confident that they know what they're doing. Although, like everybody, right, they're better at saying what they should do than what they do. But, they have taken it quite seriously for a long time. So I don't have a huge level of concern with those
Yeah, I mean,
guys.
accounting firms, it's interesting, I mean, especially in the firms that audit your companies and deal directly with the audit committee. I mean, they might have appropriate controls in place, but they tend to, like we talked about, kind of circumvent the normal sourcing process, and the contractual protections you might have in place are not as robust. So I do view that as an important component, that not only to ensure that they have the appropriate controls, but that you have contractual rights if they don't have the appropriate controls in place to hold them accountable.
Question in the back?
Shifting gears, can you guys talk a little bit about how you do continuous monitoring? So I think a lot of companies are good at like getting a vendor in the door, third party in the door, doing the initial checks, and then it's out of sight, out of mind after that. And so how have you created a repeatable process that gives you some assurance?
Yeah, I mean, I know our process at a high level, we will look at, how the vendor is rated in terms of, like I said before, low, medium, elevated, high, not only for information security, but also for business continuity, disaster recovery, and various other metrics. And then, depending on how they're rated, there'll be a cycle for how frequently they're reviewed, whether it's, 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years, whoever it might be. And it requires a lot of resources. I mean, that's the bottom line here. I mean, like we've talked about, we're not yet content to just simply rely on, third party, a BitSite score or something or any other, kind of third party. We want to, do the assessment ourselves. So it requires continual work, and you have to differentiate because we deal with thousands of vendors and we don't have thousands of people to do it. So it's a struggle. I don't think we have it perfect, and I doubt many companies do.
Yeah, no, so we do exactly the same thing, although I'll say we cheat a little bit, which is if somebody provides us with a robust response that includes attestations, we don't really look at them anymore, right? We kind of like, yep, you get a check. Even though we know you might not be perfect, we're gonna go apply our resources somewhere else. It's when somebody gives us a hard time when we cycle back on them that they get a lot more attention, because it gives, it's just natural. It just gives us less confidence that they know what they're doing. So we have a regular rotation schedule that we cycle back through our vendors based on, the level of importance of the company. But the vast majority of our strategic partners actually don't get that much of a look because they're fully prepared for what we're going to ask for, and they give us confidence right out of the gate. So we're kind of leaning towards like indicators that you might not be doing it well, which is a very subjective thing, but that's where we apply our resources.
We've got about 5 more minutes. John, why don't you also introduce yourself?
John Mastroeni, I'm the global CISO for Milcom International. So Tim, specifically for you, and I surely believe that AIG faces as well. So there's a very large Chinese technology conglomerate that is getting very hyper-focused attention by the U.S. right now.
Yes.
A lot of governments.
Yes.
How do you manage that risk, right? Because internally, it could be something, it couldn't be something, right?
Yeah.
So how do you manage that risk compared to the, oh my God, everything's on fire, to reality today?
So you're talking about Huawei.
Huawei, yeah.
And just
Yeah.
No names.
Yeah.
I can say, which is on the front page of most newspapers today.
So this is an interesting one for ARM because Huawei is not only a provider for us, but they buy from us, right? So they're a big buyer from us actually. So this is not something that we can just look at lightly and say, oh, U.S. government says don't do it, so let's not do it. The approach that we've taken and the stance that we've taken, which has involved a lot of dialogue at our senior level within the company, is that we don't have the data at this point to understand what the real risk is. We see a lot of governments taking this stance. It feels like they might be right, but they haven't actually said anything yet that would lead us to believe that Huawei is any particular threat to us as a company. I would tend to believe, this is my personal opinion now rather than ARM's opinion, I would tend to believe that the Chinese state as a whole is a larger threat than Huawei as an individual company. And the type of hacking and the work that they're doing in the background to get access to this stuff is more serious. Huawei feels like a scapegoat to me. That's my personal opinion. Now it could very much be real.
Right, but how do you manage that message up and down? Right, that's really, because I get the calls from the CEO going, what are we doing about this?
Yeah.
Right?
And it's hard when there's no U.S. supplier.
No U.S. supplier, and all the governments we care about are saying stop, do not use. Why?
I mean, it's very much business context. Business context matters a lot, right? For us, it's really important to maintain this relationship unless we absolutely can't. And in fact, we have a joint venture in China. There's a lot of complications for us around this. If most of your business relies on government contracts, then you're going to care about this a lot, right? And that's a totally different stance that you might be willing to take. I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, for us, we huddled as a senior leadership, rather than it kind of being, CISO, what are you doing about it? We huddled as a senior leadership team and went through all of the considerations around how we might look at that particular relationship and came to a wait and see approach, which is ultimately where we landed. Is we might take a more reactionary position, but at present, we don't have the data to support that. ARM's a very engineering organization. They're very data focused, and right now we have no data. So from our perspective, it wasn't actually that difficult a decision, although it did require bringing a lot of minds together. We reached it relatively quickly.
Yeah, I have not been involved in discussions that we've had internally on the topic, so I really don't have much to add to that.
Any other questions? So why don't we wrap up with just some final advice to the folks assembled?
I'm sure. So, like I touched on before, I think you really need to devote appropriate resources to this area. You need to differentiate among your vendors. You can't treat them, all the same. The high-risk ones, you need to insist on the controls. You need to monitor, or you need to not do business with them. And that's a tough conversation, like we also talked about with your business partners. But I think you need to have those type of conversations. You owe it to the firm. I think you need to continually reassess your process. If one of your vendors does have an incident and you had rated that vendor at low, That rating may have been accurate or may not have been, but you can't be oblivious to real life events. You need to take them into account at every point in time. And I think you really need to give a lot of visibility to your senior management and your directors in this area. I find that, when we have to report to your directors or your senior managers, issues take on a whole new level of significance, and people take them a lot more, seriously. So, requiring regular reporting to your managers on an issue like this is critical. And then, as I also commented on, I think cyber insurance is, an important component that everybody should consider.
Yeah, just one final thought is keep your program simple. Risk-based is the right way to look at it, but so are what you're asking your suppliers or partners to do needs to be, in my opinion, principle-based and simple. If you've got more than 15, you're looking for indicators that they don't have a good program, not trying to assess every control they have in place, right? And so trying to look for the intent behind the controls, why you want them, rather than the specific control you need them to have, is a more functional way to be able to have a good conversation with your partners.
And I would just add that, think about in the legal and compliance arena, what systems and processes that you already have in place that you can leverage to advance a third-party risk management program. With that, please join me in thanking Eric and Tim for joining us.